Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. And on behalf of Woods and our partner in this effort, the Bioenergy Institute at Stanford, and my co-director Sally Benson, who's here. It's a real pleasure to have you join us for this conversation on carbon removal in the climate solutions portfolio. Let me say just a couple of words about the Stanford investments in energy and environment, and then a few words about carbon removal as we kick off today's event. At Stanford, we're really focused on the fundamental scholarship of creating a sustainable future, but we also recognize that that involves the transition to practical solutions, and the practical solutions have to pay attention to the fundamental constraints about the way the economy works, fundamental constraints about the way the environment works, and fundamental constraints about working together in a complicated society. What we're trying to do with the Woods Institute and the Precourt Institute is integrate scholarship, action, training of the next generation of leaders to come up with practical solutions that get worked out in detailed conversation with stakeholders around the world. And this kind of session that we're having today is a big part of the investment in developing a shared understanding. I want to start out by expressing my appreciation to all of you for joining us in working out the details of what the future is going to look like. The structure of today's presentations is really intended to shift us toward being a conversation. We'll have some opening remarks that set the stage. Now, I'll ask a few questions to unfold some of the details, but the real lifeblood and the heart of today's session is going to be questions from all of you that let us really unfold the issues that are most important for you and the directions that the research, the scholarship, and the activism around this issue need to occur. I think everybody knows that climate change is real, proceeding really, really rapidly, and that based on current emissions, we're nowhere near stabilizing climate at 1.5 or 2C. In fact, the most recent estimates are that if emissions continue at the current pace, we'll hit the limit where there's less than 66% probability of holding warming below 2C, approximately July of 2032, 14 years from now. So we have a giant problem associated with either finding some way to decarbonize much more rapidly than we're decarbonizing now, to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, or to come up with some other approach to climate engineering. And there is and should be a dramatic emphasis on research in all three of those agendas. And the one that we want to think about today is this big, important, and little understood topic of our options for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, particularly using ecosystems to help us engineer this gigantic transition. A striking feature of the recent modeling studies on climate stabilization at ambitious mitigation levels, something like 2C above pre-industrial, is that most involve massive amounts of negative emissions, carbon removal from the atmosphere, by the end of the century. A typical number is carbon removal at something like 1/4 of current emissions, or more than 10 billion tons of CO2 per year. That's a massive amount of stuff, and it's not an agenda that's really been driven forward by bottom-up technology developments. It's really an agenda that's been driven primarily by a recognition in the models that it would be really convenient if there were technologies that could remove CO2 from the atmosphere in the later decades of the century, allowing us to sustain emissions in the near term. And whether or not that is technically feasible in any way really remains to be seen, and that's the topic of our discussion today. So I'm thrilled to start us off with comments from Bob Perciasepe, who, as many of you know, is president for the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and a long time leading expert in the climate change area. Prior to his work at C2ES, I'm sorry, he was the deputy administrator for the EPA and has had a number of high-level positions, including being the Secretary of the Environment for the state of Maryland. Somebody who really adds a lot of perspective to the climate issue and the solutions portfolio, and it's a pleasure to welcome Bob to our stage this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I don't know if I need this, right? You got my little, I'll move this out of the way. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I'll add my thanks. C2ES, Center for Climate and Energy Solution, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit and independent. So, and we work on climate and energy solutions. People keep asking me if we're ever going to change the name away from climate, and I say no. We're talking about carbon neutrality perhaps today on a day when net neutrality is disappearing. Let me say a little bit more about the urgency here. That tend to be a little bit lighthearted, right? This is a pretty weighty subject and one of great urgency. Chris was just talking about the urgency of looking at how much carbon dioxide we can put up in the atmosphere, and obviously the models can always adjust one way or the other, but 14 years is not that far in the future. I can look at it another way from concentration. When in 1800, I'm going to go through the whole history now. In 1800, it was about 280 parts per million in the atmosphere. And then in 1950, which was right around when I was born, it was 211. So it took 150 years to go up 31 parts per million. Think about that. Now today, in my lifetime, it is now 411 this morning in Hawaii. 411. So it's gone up 100 parts per million in my lifetime. And you can do the math there. You can figure out that it's somewhere near 67, 68 years, right? Since 1950. And so at that pace, even if you just assume that pace will continue, we'll be at 450 parts per million, which mostly translates backwards into the numbers that Chris was talking about in 20 years. So somewhere between 14 and 20 years, we're going to be at these concentrations. We're already at concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we haven't seen in millions of years. So we have quite an interesting thing. And put it in my own personal perspective, my first grandchild was born 3 weeks ago. That grandchild will be 14 years old when we hit the numbers according to Chris, and 20 years old when you hit the numbers according to me. This is the world that grandchildren and children are being born into now. So there's an urgency here that we have to look at all the different solutions that are available. And we can't really afford to be fighting amongst ourselves in the solution matrix. And I'll get to that in just a second. But we also have a time when globally and in this country, we have all these mixed signals. Are we going to attack this problem? Are we not going to attack this problem? Is it a hoax? Can we do it? Should we not do it? And while that mixed signal is there, and there was a pretty consistent signal building up for a while with the Paris Agreement sending a signal to the global economy that this is something to really take hold of, the mixed signals are now potentially creating a slowdown or perhaps even doubt among some on what needs to be done. And the Paris Agreement is kind of a broad statement, and I'm not going to obviously go through the whole thing, but at the very beginning, it doesn't say we have to remove all the emissions. This is an important thing. It says we need to balance the anthropogenic emissions with sinks. Broadly speaking, that is actually what's in the Paris Agreement. And so, toward the second half of the century, which is probably not fast enough based on what Chris and I both just said. But while the mixed signals are going on globally and in this country, many are continuing to make progress on this, from research to technology development to disclosure of risk. All of these different things are underway. And so you have cities, you have hundreds of mayors and city councils committing to take action. You have many states moving forward. Little known fact, over 25% of the population in the United States lives in an economy that has a price on carbon. It's called RGGI in California, who incidentally does things with Quebec every once in a while. And you have industry. Industry after industry is out there now talking about how they're going to reduce their carbon footprint, how they're going 100% renewable on some of their operations. I'm not going to get into the big debate about whether that's 24/7 or 365 days a year, every minute of the year, or whether some carbon electrons get into my iPhone. I am going to say, though, thank goodness that they're doing these kinds of things to get better at these technologies. So just recently in New Jersey, Governor Murphy signed a number of bills. One was on energy efficiency and offshore wind. One was a new goal of 50% renewable energy. And one was a bill that provides the economic incentives, provides the value to nuclear power plants to keep them running. If 40% of New Jersey's electricity comes from nuclear power, zero emitting nuclear power right now. If you add 50% of renewable on top of that, you have a state of New Jersey who is now committed to 90% reduction in carbon emissions by the middle of the century. So you have all these different solutions. And the big picture, almost by everybody's measure, is we need to decarbonize electricity and then make everything electric. Boom. All right? Well, there's a bunch of challenges there. How do you decarbonize electricity? Can you really just make it all renewable energy? The chances of that are not zero probably, but they're not 100% either. And so the challenges are, how do you fully decarbonize? What are we going to do 35 years from now with all the natural gas turbines we're building, coal plants that'll still be running, and on a global scale, China, India, Southeast Asia, other countries, Eastern Europe, are going to be using coal and natural gas, even if we in the United States figure out how not to do that completely, 100%. So what you have is a situation here where even if decarbonizing electricity is going to require some removal of carbon. Then move back to industrial sources. Almost a third of our greenhouse gases, 25 to 30% of our greenhouse gases in the United States come from industrial sources, from the actual act of the manufacturing, whether it's cement, steel, fermentation. If you use fermentation, anybody here drink wine? Okay, just checking. I know it's early in the morning. But certainly any kind of industrial process that uses fermentation is going to produce carbon dioxide, for instance, like making ethanol. So you have industrial processes that even if they had 100% renewable energy for their electricity, they'd still be making carbon dioxide, and something's going to have to happen to that carbon dioxide. And then transportation. Right now transportation is the largest emitting source of greenhouse gases in the United States, and it's growing in the rest of the world. We're not likely to stop flying around in jets anytime soon. And we can make some of that into biofuels. And it may take some time. We may be able to make almost all of it into biofuels. But in the meantime, we're going to have to offset those emissions somehow, some way between now and the middle of the century. So you've got all these different challenges to decarbonizing and then making everything electric. And so we're going to need all these different technologies. We're going to need renewable energy as fast as we can get it. We're going to need nuclear energy to be maintained, and there needs to be some investment in advanced nuclear. We're going to need carbon capture, not just carbon capture on a coal-fired power plant, which is sort of the typical thing people think about, but we're going to need it on steel mills. We're going to need it on ethanol plants. And actually, we have one on an ethanol plant in Decatur, Illinois, right now. And we're going to need these technologies to not only be helping us on the emissions, but if you think about what Chris said and you think about what I said in my lifetime, we're going to need some of these technologies to pull carbon out of the air, either through biological processes and then capturing that carbon and sequestering it, or through other methods. So carbon capture is a really important thing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about So here, that's that big picture. All of this stuff has to work together. And what we do have right now in our body politic, where people are debating these solutions, is people are fighting amongst themselves. Can we do it with 100% renewable? We need to get rid of those crazy overpriced nuclear power plants. Carbon capture, I don't know, it's too expensive and it'll keep coal plants running. We don't want that. And of course, if we start making a lot of bioenergy, we'll just suck up all the farmland and everyone will starve. I'm exaggerating with all those arguments. All those arguments have some kernel of things that need to be dealt with, but they are exaggerations of the different components that is essentially the solutions circular firing squad. So what we need is to rise above that and really think practically on what we need to accomplish. And so trying to do this is difficult, but recently, and again, looking at carbon capture in particular, in the budget bill that passed this winter, a section of the Internal Revenue Code or law 45Q, I know that sounds, who the heck knows what 45Q is, it's a part of the tax law, just leave it at that, but if I say 45Q again, don't hit me. So 45Q provides financial incentives for carbon capture, and it does a number of good things, but there are two challenges to carbon capture, which I hope I laid out a reason why it's really essential that we don't ignore this and try to get it going. One is cost. These things are still expensive, just like perhaps solar voltaic cells were back 15 years ago. By building more of them and getting better at it, you keep reducing the unit price. And so we need to be thinking about that with carbon capture. And 45Q provides financial incentives for the next 7 years for us to be able to deploy more of this and perhaps reduce the cost. The other one is, what do we do with the carbon when we capture it? And again, 45Q has expanded the game to also look at uses of carbon. There's geologic storage, there's enhanced oil recovery, there's making products. Here's another lighthearted comment. De Beers said they're going to go into synthetic diamonds, my preferred long-term use for carbon. Again, lighthearted on a heavy subject. But the scale of use, if we get to the levels of carbon capture we need to do, is very large. And so scaling it up is a big challenge. And so one of the things that 45Q has done is it's expanded the eligible activities to help stimulate investment and research. It's created some financial certainty in that near-term period, and it really has an increase in credit. In a sense, it is a national price on carbon, which goes up to $50 a ton for geologic sequestration by the end of the period. So one of the challenges that all of this has is building some momentum behind the technology development and getting it deployed. And so lots of innovation is out there happening. We do have carbon capture deployed at coal plants. Right now, to make them reasonably economical, they're using it for enhanced oil recovery. There's some in Canada, some in the United States. There's a new gas turbine firing up, not yet making electricity, a company called Net Power in Texas. We have carbon capture at an ADM ethanol plant in Decatur, and there's many more around the world. I'm just giving you some highlights of some of them. These things are still very expensive. And so one of the things that the Net Power process is doing is finding a way to not have to hook on a parasitic load to a power generator, but actually have carbon dioxide be the actual end result of the whole generation of electricity. So a lot of good things going on there. The key step for 45Q is building a political coalition. If we want to get the battling solutions to come together, we need to think about how we can explain what's in it for everybody. And so when we did 45Q in this country, it became bipartisan. We had Sheldon Whitehouse and Senator Barrasso from Wyoming as to two key co-sponsors. There was also Capito from West Virginia and Heidkamp from North Dakota. They came at it for different reasons, but they stood together on a podium and talked about how important it was to do this, from jobs all the way to climate change. And so building this coalition is the important factor. There was labor, there was technology, there were the coal interests, oil gas interests, climate change interests, environmental, labor. All of these came together, and that is what we need to be thinking about in the future as we try to build this path forward that's going to include all these different technologies. Excluding any of them prematurely is a fool's errand, given the challenge that we have over the next 30 to 40 years. And the rest of the world is not as far along on some of these things as the United States is, and some are farther along on other aspects of it. But these technologies are going to be needed globally, and we need to be developing them, and the best place to develop them is here in the United States. In a way, bipartisanship, because of the nature of our business, we need the solutions to be durable politically. We can't have this pendulum like we currently have. And we need to have that coalition come together to help make that happen. And I call it the Zero Emission Coalition, as opposed to the Carbon Capture Coalition, which would include the Carbon Capture Coalition. It would include people in favor of advanced nuclear, and would include going full bore on renewable energy. So you got to have all these things working together. Carbon capture is going to be a key element, particularly when we have to get into negative emissions. And here's where you talk about biomass and then capturing the carbon from the use of biomass when you're making energy. So lots of challenges there. This is the big picture that we have to deal with. And I'm looking forward to participating with the panel where we'll talk about more of these details and some of the technology with all of you. So thanks, Chris, again for the invite. And let's go to the next step.
Great. And if there's one or two quick technical questions for Bob, he can take them now, and then we'll transition to the panel.
Oh, okay. I can do that. Diamonds?
If not, yeah, I love diamonds. Why don't we transition to the panel, and if everybody would join me on the stage. Really fortunate to be joined by a distinguished group today. So in addition to Bob, who's just laid out the issues so compellingly, to his left is Professor Sally Benson, who's the co-director of the Precourt Energy Institute at Stanford and a professor of energy resources engineering, someone who has worked on carbon capture for a couple of decades, since way before it was popular, and has really been a pioneer in this area. And to her left is Dan Sanchez, who's a AAAS Science and Policy Fellow and a soon-to-be faculty member at UC Berkeley, who's done some of the most detailed analysis on near-term opportunities for carbon removal from existing facilities. And to his left, my right, is Dr. Catherine Mock, who's a senior research scientist in the Department of Earth System Science at Stanford, director of the Stanford Environment Assessment Facility, and former co-director of science for the IPCC. Let me start out with a question for Sally. I wonder if you can help us understand the landscape a little bit. In particular, I think it'd be useful to have a definition for BECCS, biomass energy with carbon capture and storage, and where it came from and why it's such a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I first heard about BECCS actually when I was working with the Global Energy Assessment, and we were looking at the integrated assessment models, and in these there were these enormous chunks of negative emissions, meaning you are actually taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And I asked the modelers, it's like, what is this? And oh my goodness, this is at the same scale really as our energy system is today. And so that was my first introduction. So BECCS, the idea is that you use plants to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. You then take that biomass feedstock and you use it to produce energy. and most commonly electricity, but it could also be used with an industrial facility where you want the heat. And then you capture the carbon dioxide by some kind of solvent extraction process, and then you compress it into essentially a liquid that you can then pump underground for permanent sequestration. And there are a number of options. You can put it in depleted oil and gas reservoirs, or you can put it into aquifers with very salty water that doesn't have any other purpose. So that's the basic idea. In terms of potential, I mean, there are two aspects of it. One is that you have the size of the biomass resource, and then the second is what's the quantity of CO2 that you could sequester in the subsurface. And both of those are really big numbers. And I like to think of it in terms of gigaton scale carbon dioxide removal. So if it can't be done at the gigaton scale globally, it's probably not too interesting. And I think by every measure, there's a suggestion that BECCS could achieve this gigaton per year CO2 removal from the atmosphere.
Great,
Yep.
thank you. And Dan, coming at it from the other direction, you're one of the people who's put the most effort into understanding the economics and practicality of biomass energy with carbon capture and storage that's already occurring. And can you introduce us to where we are with the technologies on the ground?
Sure. So one stat I like to use when I introduce this topic is if you look at the models, the scenarios that Bob spoke about, that Sally just mentioned, we're talking about 10 billion tons of CO2 in carbon removal really by about the mid-century or by the end of the century, depending on which model you look at. Right now, we're actually sequestering 1/100% of that. Not to put too fine of a point on it, but it is 1 million tons of CO2 per year at a corn ethanol biorefinery in Decatur, Illinois. So it turns out we get about 6% of our transportation energy in the United States from ethanol derived from cornstarch. So instead of feeding it to cows, we ferment it and produce ethanol that we then burn at roughly 10% in our light-duty vehicles that we drive. It turns out that that is existing bioenergy, that is market-supported bioenergy, that is cost-effective bioenergy, and it produces a pure stream of CO2, meaning that you don't need to use any of the costly sorbents or solvents that Sally mentioned before to capture and compress that carbon. So looking at the entire resource, the US, along with Brazil, are the largest ethanol producers in the world. Both of them are blessed with relatively plentiful geologic sequestration opportunities, and we think that we can probably put about the equivalent of 1% to 2% of US CO2 emissions at present underground from these ethanol processes using bioenergy with carbon capture. And that's equivalent to about 30 to 40 million tons of CO2 per year. That is currently essentially just being vented into the atmosphere from these fermenters where we turn sugars and starches into ethanol. Yeah.
Great. And Catherine, if we can zoom back out and talk about the scale of the biomass resource, both that we have and that we would need to deploy BECCS at these multi-gigaton scales. Where are we in our understanding of whether we're even close to a match between the potential supply and the requirements if we wanted to operate at these tens of gigatons?
Great. So much of the work we've been doing over the last few years has very much started with those numbers that Sally introduced and Dan reemphasized of 10 or maybe even 15 billion tons of CO2 removal per year. And anyone who takes a look at those numbers has an immediate sense that they're big if you start to do some simple back-of-the-envelope comparisons. So for example, to generate enough bioenergy biomass as a feedstock to support that type of carbon removal currently would be about 25, maybe even up to 80% of agricultural lands globally right now. These are incredibly big numbers. So what we've been doing, as Chris is alluding to here, is putting them into focus, right-sizing our emphasis on what is big, how fast is fast, and then how do we think about the really smart entry points, like Dan described, and as Sally emphasized, that can maybe get us to 1 billion tons. So some of this right sizing has involved, again, global looks at the biomass resource. So we can say with something like the MODIS data set, which looks at how much biomass is being produced globally each year, how big is that resource? And in particular, where are there near-term entry points where you wouldn't necessarily have to put all of the biomass onto ships or transport it over long distances of continent? And if you look at that biomass resource that is overlying geologic storage, it's about 1 billion tons per year that's on marginal agricultural lands. If you release that constraint and say we're not just going to use residues from agriculture and we're not just going to use marginal lands, you could bump it up to 8 billion tons per year, but that would require deforestation. And we can get into this more, but we've done a similar analysis here in the US where the data sets are really good. We have looked very carefully at saline aquifers and the potential for different feedstocks to supply biomass, whether that's from agricultural residues, woody biomass, or dedicated bioenergy crops. And looking at the numbers in the billion-ton study for 2020, and pairing them together with a really careful analysis of how much CO2 you could inject underground and how fast, making it commercially feasible. That's around 100 million tons of CO2 in the US right now, where you wouldn't need long-distance transport of biomass or CO2. And in some ways, it's kind of a neat entry point in that this is all about rural economies, over 1,000 counties in the US, where that type of technology could be feasible in the somewhat near term.
That's really helpful. Given that we're at the kind of baby step stage of deployment of these technologies, Sally, it'd be really useful if you could give us a little better picture of the technology readiness on the biomass growth end, the processing and energy end, and on the capture and sequestration end.
Right, yeah. So as we heard earlier from Bob, the basic technology of carbon dioxide capture and storage is available today. And the technology for taking biomass feedstocks and producing electricity is available today. In the United States, there are 300 power plants, biomass-powered power plants that are operating today. They tend to be pretty small. They're on the scale of about 25 megawatts each, which is actually kind of interesting because, Katie mentioned that there were 1,000 counties that had the potential for creating, BECCS opportunities. And in those counties, the average size or median size power plant would be around 12 megawatts. So from that perspective, the scale on the power production is very similar to what we do today. So there aren't really any fundamental hurdles there. In terms of capturing carbon dioxide, that technology is also available. It was developed for a different industry. It was developed primarily for cleaning up natural gas, but we use those same chemicals and those same kind of equipment. So we can do that. However, it is expensive. About $100 a ton to capture CO2 today with that kind of facility. So that is quite mature. In terms of the maturity and technology readiness for pumping carbon dioxide underground, actually the US is the world leader in this technology, and it began back in the 1970s for the purpose of enhancing oil recovery. But it's the exact same technology. You need to drill wells, you need to compress and pump CO2 underground, and again, we can do all of that. So the fundamental building blocks of doing this, and actually transportation as well, we have 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines in the US. So all of those are mature. What's different about BECCS, and where perhaps there's both opportunity and challenge, in that the typical project is going to be quite small. I mentioned that it was going to be around 12 megawatts per project, and that's about 60,000 tons of CO2 per year. CCS technology was really built with a larger scale in mind. So the question is how do you sort of right size or downsize all these available technologies to be able to employ it for this purpose? And I'll just say one other thing. A lot of the small size of the projects is determined by the radius or the area over which you collect biomass. And it's typically thought that, you know, transporting biomass for more than 50 to 100 miles gets to be too expensive, and it takes a lot of energy to transport that. But it turns out if you sort of take a look at the US map slightly differently, you can aggregate over larger areas, and your average power plant is going to be something on the order of, say, 100 megawatts, and you'll have about 500,000 tons per year, which gets it closer to the scale of the CCS projects that are taking place today. And I'll just give you one more number. So in terms of the amount of carbon capture and storage today, it's around 31 million tons per year. Spread over about 20 or so projects. So this technology has matured, though perhaps not with the visibility of some things like photovoltaics and so forth that have made, you know, dramatic and rapid process because of the enormous scale that they've been deployed on.
And while we're talking about the enablers, we've heard that CO2 cleanup, capture, and compression can be done at about $100 a ton, and that the 45Q provides a financial incentive of up to about 50. There's still a big financial gap there. I don't know if Dan or Bob, you want to comment on what the technology enablers for next steps with creating opportunities to bridge this price gap might look like.
Sure. I'll say a little bit, and then Bob, you should absolutely step in. So one thing that I think is actually pretty interesting, as I mentioned before, probably the first place we'll start doing bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. It's not on these small, medium, or large scales size power plants in the United States. Unfortunately, that's not economic. The place where it really is economic today is to capture CO2 from corn ethanol biorefineries. And we think that the vast majority of CO2 from these biorefineries can be captured and compressed and put into a pipeline ready for sequestration for about $30 per ton. That is, again, lower than the $50 per ton that is paid, that can be paid for through the 45Q tax credits. It turns out that enhanced oil recovery pays about $35 a ton as well. And so you have stacking a few things together, including things like these tax credits, including things like low carbon fuel policies. California, for example, has a very large low carbon fuel market. There's one in Oregon as well. We're looking at adopting similar policies in the countries of Canada and Brazil. I think that it really comes to kind of stacking supportive policies that weren't necessarily meant for ethanol with carbon capture, but probably meant for other forms of CCS or other forms of low carbon transportation fuels. That's really going to be where the near-term opportunity is to start gaining experience with bioenergy with carbon capture and scaling up. I think there's some other really interesting opportunities when you start thinking about carbon utilization, which I think, as Bob mentioned, the 45Q tax credits also do treat on a level playing field. And really, I think there's opportunities to make higher value, long-lived products from carbon dioxide. These are relatively small markets, but near-term entry points. And Bob, I don't know if you want to say more.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of very quick things. Obviously, what's happening now with a lot of these different technologies, including BECCS, and carbon capture in general, renewable energy, whether it's wind or solar, and nuclear. And all of these we need to solve the climate problem and to make progress on it. We find them different places trying to find a way to put a value on those attributes. And so you have states enacting laws to try to adjust the value for a nuclear power plant. You have some state, California, for instance, under their carbon removal program under the original Assembly Bill 32, has now has a general framework for carbon capture credits even. And so you've got, and then you've got the federal incentives that have been put in place, production tax credits for renewable energy, which has stimulated the industry tremendously over the last half a decade. So you see all these places. What's missing here is something that 45Q has done for the first time, but only in this very specific realm that Dan was just talking about, is a federal price on carbon. And so here's where the intersection of policy and technology and investment intersects. And so you have places where it's happening, whether it's California or whether it's a tax credit for renewable energies, or whether it's states trying to put an additional zero emission credit for a nuclear power plant, or whether it's even the United States Congress enacting a law to provide a little bit of incentive because of the attributes of capturing carbon. You know, what we don't have is the unified field theory, to capture a physics term, you know, where we can bring this together and really stimulate all these technologies at the same time, which this lends itself a little bit to the internecine battling that goes on, who can get their piece. But I think it's a tried and true method that if you provide if there's a public purpose and you provide some financial incentive for those public purposes, that the technology development will accelerate.
Yeah, the encouraging message that I hear from all of you is that we really do have a compelling set of technologies and enabling policies. They're maybe not perfectly designed, but by stitching pieces together, it really looks like the incentives are in place in order to take next steps. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, I think so. So one stat I'd like to use is that the United States currently invests about $6 billion per year in clean energy research and development, and that's across the numerous agencies that care about energy production and energy use. And when we look at these opportunities, I think we see that these same agencies can develop carbon removal technologies, whether that is things like growing more forests or storing carbon in soils, or the engineer technologies that can capture CO2 from the air or from biomass. It's really, the US Department of Energy will still be pioneering carbon capture and bioenergy conversion technologies. They just need to think a little bit more holistically about how they do it. The US Department of Agriculture will still be encouraging conservation and implementing cost share programs to pay for advanced technologies, including energy technologies. They just need to think a little bit more broadly about carbon utilization. And the Department of Interior, which manages the public lands that we have in the United States, they're still going to be managing grazing permits. They're still going to be managing forests for resilience. They just need to be really in line and in tune with, I think, the overall goal, which is using the land sector to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and ultimately balance sources and sinks.
Actually, that leads me into where I wanted to go next. Catherine, obviously one of the most time-honored and inexpensive approaches for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is to do a better job with stewarding ecosystems, increasing the amount of carbon that's in forests and soils. And how should we think about the opportunity there and the juxtaposition between these stewardship opportunities and the ones that have the industrial component through BECCS?
Great. So as Sally emphasized at the very start of our conversation around BECCS, key feature of how you get CO2 out of the atmosphere with the technology we've emphasized so far is that the capture is biological. Photosynthesis, tried and true. But with BECCS, the end game for that CO2 is storage underground. But as we all know, trees sit on the landscape for a very long time. They not only have biomass above ground, they've got roots underground. That carbon can move into the soil through a whole bunch of different processes over long periods. So a real question is, how do we think about this full spectrum of carbon removal in its interactions and the different way we have readiness right now, the different ways that co-benefits for other objectives people have appear on this space? And I think the interesting thing about carbon removal that starts with photosynthesis, but that also ends with biology, carbon just sitting on or in the landscape, is that it's actually doable right now. We know how to plant trees. We know what processes in terms of agriculture have led to release of carbon from soils through time. And there's a lot of ability to tap that. But the key thing is that there are also risks. So for example, if we store tons of carbon in forests and we let the temperature of the planet increase to 4 degrees Celsius in this century between 7 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit, that carbon is at risk of reversal. So much of the landscape is slow in terms of carbon accumulating and then fast out in terms of disturbances such as wildfire. In terms of how this is appearing in policy so far, there are a number of different examples. One that we've looked at is a forest offset program that's happening throughout the US, but it's linked in particular to California's cap and trade program. So this, again, is a small program. It is removing 5 million tons of CO2 per year, and then those offset credits are being sold in California's cap and trade market. But it's revealed a lot of really interesting lessons in terms of how to smartly tap the land sector in a climate policy landscape. So there's always a question around additionality if you want to tap the land. Would that carbon have been stored in the absence of the policy environment? And what's really clear is that the traditional emphasis on additionality has said, let's not do anything unless you wouldn't have done it in the absence of the climate policy. But what the California program and many of these different programs tapping land has emphasized is that oftentimes a smart view of additionality in terms of removing carbon from the atmosphere is you kind of want the opposite of that initial wisdom. You want programs that make a lot of sense not just because of the carbon, but also because you're improving soil health, or because you're advancing jobs, or because you're improving water quality. And those types of co-benefits are really what we've seen in terms of the California program, where the landowners who are participating are timber companies or investment landholders. Not necessarily companies that would say, I'm all about protecting endangered species, but they're starting with carbon, which is valued at about $10 a ton on the carbon market in California, and getting all sorts of co-benefits downstream. So those co-benefits, I think, are really interesting in terms of the full suite of options for stewardship, and they also look different depending on what type of approach you're examining.
You know, I think every one of you so far has mentioned this concept of co-benefits and thinking about especially the initial deployments of carbon dioxide removal technologies in settings where the co-benefits come into focus. And I wonder if you could say, each of you, a little bit more about what the co-benefits might be and whether or not the policy instruments are in place in order to allow us to take advantage of those co-benefits. And I don't know, Sally, if you want to start from the more industrial side.
Yeah, so I think I'll look at it through the energy lens. We heard earlier about the potential for meeting 100% of our electricity from renewable resources. And if we only have the sun and the wind, which are really the prevalent resources, getting to 100% can be really challenging. And so I think what BECCS provides is the opportunity to have a stable base load or flexible type of power generation that's complementary to the wind and the sun, which you have very little control over. So I think that particularly on a distributed, sort of rural electrification scale, that combination of BECCS and wind and sun might start to really make sense as a portfolio as how you would really try to get to this carbon neutral or even carbon negative electricity. So I think that's one of the big benefits that could be achieved.
Great. I want to focus on, I think, two co-benefits, both of which I hope others kind of pick up and say more about. I think in terms of developing advanced CCS technologies, advanced engineered carbon removal technologies, I think if and when the world becomes serious about climate change mitigation again, these are technologies that the United States can leverage its existing R&D investments, its existing oil and gas infrastructure, its existing kind of advanced technological leadership to export around the world to places where there might be better biomass resources, there might be better geologic storage potential, or there might be countries that are willing to take a lead. And I think there's a real technological leadership here. But I don't want to lose sight of kind of the essential part of this, which is all of these sectors or all of these solutions involve the land sector. And I think there's a real opportunity to think about revitalizing rural economies, increasing farm incomes, creating new streams of revenue for farmers and ranchers and forest owners and managers around the United States that is just really being begun to be thought about. The idea that the agriculture sector, obviously energy intensive, obviously a net source of emissions right now, can become a net sink. And can play a really important role in climate change mitigation, not just in the US, but worldwide, I think is a really exciting prospect and one that, again, we're just beginning to think about.
Catherine, you spoke quite a lot about the co-benefits of ecosystem management. Do you want to say more about ecosystem health?
Great. I mean, I guess one thing that is a crosscut here is that the nature of the co-benefits can intersect in some really interesting ways with how you design the policy. So for example, with the forest offset program we've been looking at, we've got great data on carbon in forests across the US, forest inventory analysis through the US Forest Service. So in that sense, what we've done in the US is something that's actually quite unusual in the international stage, is a very, very rigorous project-by-project accounting of exactly what is happening to the carbon. And in a funny way, we've actually been a lot looser in terms of understanding the quantification of those co-benefits for ecosystems, even though there are a lot of endangered species activity centers near and around these forests, for water, for tourism, for hunting, et cetera. But in other sectors of the land, it's actually a lot harder to know exactly how much carbon there is, and in particular, what the deltas are, where if you change your soil management practices, exactly how fast is that carbon changing? It's a big investment to measure that soil carbon. It's highly variable through space. It depends on the soil type. It depends on the management that you're applying. And in some of those types of approaches, the best answer for ecosystem health might be not to say that this is going to be about exact measurement of every ton of carbon, but an embedding that looks at the different revenue flows that can be relevant to achieve all of these different outcomes in tandem.
Great. Well, I would say, oh, go ahead, Bob, yeah.
Very quickly, I'm not going to get into to the extent that carbon capture and BECCS and all the related technologies are a critical element, which I outlined earlier, of a decarbonization strategy that also includes electrification. Once you decarbonize electricity, huge public health benefits are co-benefits. I mean, I always want to keep those on the table from the entire enterprise of decarbonization. It's a very substantial amount of public health benefits globally.
Not only from the climate change benefits, but from the decreased air pollution.
Just air pollution.
Yeah, a wonderful point. The overall theme of most of the comments, both about the technology and the economics, has been a relatively positive one until now, but a lot of the scholarship from our groups has been warning about the potential limits to which these technologies can be deployed. And Sally, do you want to start us off on thinking about where those limits might come from?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So we did a couple of things. We looked at the availability of biomass. So that was the first. If you don't have the biomass, you can't do this. Then we said, okay, well, if we are really going to be transportation limited, meaning that we can't move the biomass, hundreds or thousands of miles, that we need to find places where the biomass resources is co-located with the sequestration. So if you look at the US for 2020, and you look at the amount of biomass would be like the equivalent of 400 million tons of CO2 per year. But when you say, well, it has to be co-located with a sequestration site, that's where you get down to this 100 million tons per year. So that's sort of the first big cut. The second thing we did is we said, well, just because the biomass resource and the sequestration site are co-located, maybe we don't have enough capacity. Maybe there simply isn't enough pore space in the subsurface, or maybe the rocks are not permeable enough to accommodate the rate of injection. And it turns out when we took a very detailed look at this based on extensive work by the USGS, it turns out that capacity and injectivity are not limitations whatsoever. So really the biggest limitation in terms of the size of the potential for negative emissions has to do with this co-location, which is fundamentally built around this idea that the transportation is going to limit the distances you can transport the biomass. So now if some research were to be done to make it so that you could very efficiently and cost effectively make pellets, for example, that could be put on trains or boats, you know, that could change the picture, and maybe we could sort of triple the size of the potential. But right now, it really seems that the co-location is the single limit, the largest limiting factor in the U.S.
And Catherine, could you help us understand the limits on the amount of available biomass and the implications of trying to scale up production of specialized energy crops on a timetable that be consistent with the deployment we're talking about?
Great. So really where we started was those economic models that get to 12 billion tons of CO2 removal per year in the end of the century, largely through BECCS. And I'm going to talk about a paper that was led by a postdoc here, and all of the work he did was focused on top-down right-sizing. He's now working in a very compelling job in the private sector where his whole point was this top-down right-sizing stuff is just too depressing. So with that caveat, what I'll say is we looked really hard at not just the total amount of land or the total amount of water that would be required to get to 10 or 15 billion tons of CO2 removal per year. As I mentioned at the very start, in terms of the total land, it's something like 25 to 80% of current agricultural land. That's a ton. It's almost up to 10% of the land surface. So the next thing we did was, there's been a lot of work in this, what would the total footprint be? But there hasn't been very much work in the next step, bringing it closer to the present moment, which is how fast would bioenergy cropland have to expand to get to these end-of-century deployments that would be really big and that would potentially double the remaining carbon budget for these really ambitious limits on warming, like 2 degrees Celsius. So what we did was just say, how fast is bioenergy cropland expanding in 2 degrees Celsius scenarios? And not just in the end of the century, but really when they're ramping up rapidly, which starts 2 years from now in 2020 and cruises through the middle of the century. And so what we found is that the rate at which bioenergy cropland was expanding is around 9 million hectares per year, 2020 to 2050. So 9 million hectares per year. Is that a lot or a little? So then we created some relatable units where we looked at the major progress we've made with commodity crop agriculture over the last 3 decades. So in particular, soybean is the commodity crop that has expanded the most rapidly at the global scale. And we also looked at oil palm, which has expanded rapidly, but more in a relative sense, in that it started from a very small land base. So that value of 9 million hectares per year of bioenergy cropland being brought on board is equivalent to 4 times the rate of expansion for soybean and 19 times the rate of expansion of oil palm. If you then run through, well, what if we were to limit bioenergy crop expansion to something like soybean, you similarly cut those end-of-century numbers by large margins, 2.5 to 10-fold.
So if we think about the limits and that we may only be able to deploy BECCS at a fraction of what the models are calling for, where does that leave us in terms of thinking about deployment of CCS in the energy portfolio? And I guess the question is, if it's not going to scale to 100%, does that mean that we should start looking at other things, or should we continue to focus on it and take advantage of it where it fits? Dan?
That's a great question, and this is what keeps me up at night in a way. I think that we tend sometimes to assume that we can forecast the world a little too much, I'll say a little bit about that. I think the appropriate balance between risk and opportunity here is that there are substantial near-term risks, substantial near-term opportunities and substantial uncertainty about long-term implications and scalability of bioenergy with CCS technologies. I think that provides relatively little reason not to step on the gas right now. But it likely means that we need to think even more broadly about the ways that we manage the land sector and that we develop and scale carbon removal technologies. There's a whole suite of carbon removal technologies that we're just barely beginning to scratch the surface on. That includes things like directly capturing CO2 from the atmosphere, so not going through biomass, but just using carbon capture, the same technologies that Sally is developing, not to capture CO2 from power plants, but to capture them directly from the air. It includes thinking really, in a really interesting way about things like enhanced mineralization, mining rocks from underground and exposing them to the air to capture more CO2 and fix them as carbonates. It involves thinking really creatively about maybe how we use the ocean. It's not terrestrial biomass at that point. It could be microalgae, it could be macroalgae. We are just beginning to think about what a fully scaled up portfolio of carbon removal solutions looks like.
Really interesting thought. One of the issues that has been on the minds of scholars thinking about carbon dioxide removal for some time now is the moral hazard that's associated with saying, well, it's fine to continue high levels of emissions now if we have this almost magical technology that will allow us to pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in later decades in the century. And one of the biggest, I guess, ethical and conceptual struggles associated with biomass solutions has been how to think about this moral hazard component. Sally, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. I mean, that is the worry, that if we're going to be able to remove all this carbon dioxide, maybe we don't need to worry so much. I mean, I guess that attitude really bothers me a lot. I mean, if someone came to you and said, oh, well, let's not worry about wastewater treatment. Let's just dispose of our sewage in the oceans and our lakes and our rivers because, by the way, we have a technology to clean up the lake or the river, the ocean. When posed that way, we would go, that's a ridiculous thing. Of course, we know it's much more difficult to capture, to clean up a lake or an ocean or a river than it is to, have a centralized water treatment facility. So I think that we need to begin to think about carbon dioxide in that way, that anytime we have a concentrated point source, we should think about how do we capture and sequester that, because no matter how you look at it, that is going to be easier than letting it go into the atmosphere where the concentrations are extremely dilute. So, so just the sheer numbers. If you compare capturing CO2 from a natural gas plant or a coal plant to capturing it from the atmosphere, it takes like 4 times more energy to capture it from the atmosphere than it does to capture it from this concentrated source. So really the question is why do we want to do this? So from my perspective, it's sort of the opposite of the moral hazard argument, in that given that there are going to be limitations to carbon dioxide removal technologies, it should reinforce the urgency of doing everything that we can do now to avoid having to get to that situation where it's going to commit land, energy, water, human capital to do something that is much closer at hand in terms of our ability to solve it now.
Bob, did you want to comment on this one?
Yeah, I think a frame that I would, in addition to the moral issues involved, including with some of the geoengineering kinds of ideas that we have, what would the governance around that be? But is one, the frame I would think about is in long-term sustainability. If you, what is it? Katie barred the door, but let's keep emitting. What the heck? We know we'll invent something eventually. There's already ideas. There's already there's already prototypes and pilot projects underway. and maybe it'll be cheaper than we ever thought, which these are things that are in the Twitter sphere even today. So, but what do you do with all that carbon? If we just keep putting it up in the atmosphere and then we have to spend more and more money to capture it, what do we do with it? Yeah, when do we find the balance between, which is in the normal nature of things, 300 years ago. Now with the size of population that we have on Earth and the amount of resource demands that it has, how do we build a sustainable global community? And it's not like polluting the atmosphere and fixing it later. I mean, it's just not practical. And it's not sustainable.
Catherine, one of the things that I found really striking in the studies that you did is that even though we're talking about large-scale negative emissions at the end of the century, the pace of the buildup of those technologies, even in the integrated assessment models, is really rapid. Do you want to speak to how those two things fit together?
Yeah, so I think this kind of raises the question of what is the balanced optimist view on this very complicated landscape. I think in some ways we've started with the fact that this is the first energy technology that has been invented by an economic model. And I think it's important to recognize that that happened in some ways because it's basically saying, is there any way to get to a 2°C world with a snapshot focus on year 2100, where we could overshoot in the near term and come way down and not only go negative, but go super negative? So I think getting to this question, I just emphasize one last feature of that landscape, which is in terms of the can-kicking ethics or the moral hazard, there's also a really open question in terms of climate change impacts. So if we let temperature cruise up past 1.5, 2°C, and then come back down to 1.5 or 2°C, an open scientific question is, are the impacts of that climate change the same, whether you're on the upswing in a temperature trajectory or on the downswing? And basically, as of 3 years ago, no one in the scientific community had ever considered studying climate change impacts on a downswing, but now they are, again, thanks to this resurgence of the concept. And it's actually quite interesting that we have real reasons to suspect that the impacts will not be the same on a downswing as compared to an upswing. So for example, on the downswing, we might be dealing with the fact that as we pass up through increasing magnitudes of warming, the permafrost in the Arctic melts, and that releases CO2 and methane. So on the downswing, we might actually have a whole lot more greenhouse gas in the atmosphere that we need to deal with as compared to if we limited warming in an upswing sense. There are also really open, important questions around some of the tipping points in our Earth system. So if we cruise up past 1 through to 2°C, in that window there, we put a high risk of losing a large fraction of the Greenland ice sheet, which is many meters of sea level rise. We also really have no idea what could happen with species, where if they migrate up that mountain and ecosystem shifts, are they going to migrate back down? That is a totally open scientific question. So I think for this question of kind of how fast do we see all the different pieces coming together, I think the right answer in some ways is that when we think about the endgame energy system that is decarbonized, as it has to be to have stabilized the climate, we clearly understand that there are sectors that are hard to decarbonize, whether it's airline emissions or long-distance trucking, or what are we going to do about cement and steel. And in that sort of a landscape, at any one moment in time, carbon removal can be incredibly valuable. And to get there in the end game, we need to be starting now. But it's really important not to displace some of these questions or to mistake one for the other.
Great. I'd like to go to audience questions after one more, so you can think about the things that you want to ask. And I wanted to close with a point that Catherine raised and Bob raised in his comments as well, that we know, at least for the foreseeable future, there are a whole portfolio of very difficult to imagine eliminating emissions from things like aircraft travel, from many parts of industry, and from many parts of agriculture. And when we talk about deploying massive amounts of negative emissions, we need large amounts just to offset those, to think about managing those. And when we think about driving the global economy net negative, it further increases the magnitude of the need. And I guess the question I'd like to close with is, given what we know about the capability of the biosphere and the subsurface to participate in this process, are we, how do we think about it in portfolio mode, I guess? It's clear that biomass energy with carbon capture and storage isn't going to do everything. And what else do we need to do in order to make it do as much as possible? And that is a question that everybody has touched on. And closing thoughts would be really helpful.
Well, I'll say one thing, and that is I used to worry a lot about the big question, and I found it much easier to sleep at night if I focus on what I can do right now, and whether that is pulling the levers of near-term policy, near-term economics, near-term institutions, with that broad picture in mind of where we need to go. I think that there is so much that needs to be done right now that hopefully we can start on that and then sort the rest out later.
I guess I'll offer a thought that a billion tons a year seems to be within the realm of possibilities. With a reasonable degree of confidence, there are no either sequestration limits, or it appears this is a conservative estimate of biomass availability. A billion tons a year ain't bad. I mean, given where we are, given that carbon dioxide concentrations are still going up, given that we've got a huge part of the world that's just beginning to get the advantage of the economic development that we've benefited from for a century. I think we're going to need everything we can get. I think it's way too early to assume we have perfect foresight of when and how and what we'll need. And so I think this is a pathway that provides one real opportunity that's built around technologies that are fundamentally available now, that has these co-benefits. And I think that's the way to think about this in a portfolio. It's a useful part, and it's likely to contribute.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it. Several of the people on the panel have mentioned the concept of right sizing. This is clearly a set of technologies that has potential, and it's clearly a set of technologies that is not so rich with potential that we shouldn't be working on all the other things. Let me transition it to questions from the audience. We have microphones, and if you will wait for a microphone so that we can hear the question, that'd be spectacular. Also, if you could identify yourself at the start of the question and try to keep the questions as brief as possible. There's one up here.
Howdy. Zach Valdez, AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow with the Senate Energy Natural Resources Committee. I'm curious about what the impact of low natural gas prices are and developing consistent and sustainable policy recommendations to keep bioenergy as a economic force within the energy sector. And also, what are the impacts of growing mainly corn on soil health? That's not a very sustainable way to keep rural economies going, because that takes a lot of fertilizer. It's not great for soil. So any ideas on that?
Who wants to tackle the economic
Maybe I'll offer a thought on natural gas and the low-price natural gas, and it's basically pushing coal out of the mix and so forth. But we also have wind and solar, which are basically zero marginal cost resources, meaning they don't use fuel. So in any kind of competitive markets, they can bid in at very low prices, particularly with production tax credits and so forth. So that set of three technologies is putting enormous pressure on every other option. I think that one of the things that can be helpful in leveling the playing field is really start thinking about natural gas plus carbon capture and storage as a way to reduce its own emissions and provide sort of low-cost flexible relatively low-cost flexible generation. But things like nuclear power, carbon-free, are really being disadvantaged right now. And I think that we have to think about how do you value dispatchability, meaning that you can have it on when you need it. I think we have to think about how do you create a situation where things that are must run, like nuclear power plants and probably biomass energy plus CCS, may be also a technology that you don't want to be ramping up and down. We need to create market structures to incentivize and keep those in the mix, because if we're in a situation where we get more and more reliant on solar and wind without these stable backups, we might be jeopardizing the quality of our electricity system, and that would be economically, very harmful to people and businesses and so forth. So we need to just start to value them differently, and if we don't change that, we're just going to continue to erode, other low carbon options that are going to be really important in the long run.
And a price on carbon could help drive CCS with natural gas. So it
Right,
could also
yes.
eventually help drive CCS with
Yeah.
BECCS.
Yeah.
I'm happy to dive in and spend a second talking about corn and corn ethanol. It's one of my favorite topics. So I think the right way to think about the opportunity that we have to capture carbon from existing corn ethanol biorefineries is that it provides near-term economic opportunity. It helps us develop technology, and it does improve the impact of conventional biofuels. I think, so there, using California's numbers, we would expect emissions reductions from a corn ethanol biorefinery with carbon capture of about 40% from the baseline that we set right now in terms of the total impact from a greenhouse gas perspective of corn ethanol. So there is a measurable benefit that we get from doing carbon capture on corn ethanol, but that is very different, I think, from a long-term vision of both engineered and natural carbon solutions working together to really turn the land sector into or enhance the ability of the land sector to remain a sink. I think that'll include things like perennial agriculture, things like agroforestry, things like cover crops when you between your corn and your soy rotations. It'll include things like vibrant forest product markets that incentivize forests to grow and also forests to be managed for sustainability. And that's a big vision that's very different from this question of do we use the crop land that we have right now where we're growing corn to make ethanol or not?
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me is that when we think broadly across the transition to sustainability space, we think about bold innovations in almost every energy technology, and that making modest changes in the way we do agriculture, what we grow, how we fertilize it, seem like they should fit in and be practical in that context. Subtle things like changing the amount of fertilizer, changing the way that the soils are managed can have a big impact on the sustainability of corn, which is of course very convenient because you can use it for food or feed or fuel. And once you have more information about what the need is, you can fine tune to other crops. And Bob.
Just some curious notes on this. I actually went to the Cornell Ag School when I was a youngin', and when I graduated the Cornell Ag School, a good yield of corn per acre was about 80 bushels. Today it's pushing 200 bushels. And part of that is agricultural chemicals and better application in an agronomic way, but most of it is from genetics, genetic improvement in the corn. And I'll echo what Dan was saying in that, and I think others have mentioned here, and that is, how you manage the root structures in the crops is how you can how you can enhance the carbon content of the soil. And I'm going back to markets here. If farmers could get a couple of bucks an acre in addition to a cover crop for putting more carbon back in the soil, most of the arable soils in the United States have been depleted of a lot of carbon because of the years of removing it. There are ways to manage crops, and there's ways to genetically modify some of the crops to have deeper roots that you can put more carbon back in the soil. There's probably a good 30 years of that we could do, and it's a significant amount of sequestration of carbon. But nobody will get paid for it right now.
Good point. Let's take one to the back and then we'll come back to the front.
Hi, Dan Zarin, Climate and Land Use Alliance. Thanks for a really informative panel discussion. I guess one question that I have that I'd like to sort of ask you to focus on a little bit is the sink function that the land sector is already performing. We have these discussions a lot, but one of the points that seems to me to get lost quite a bit is that we're already dependent on this sink function very much for somewhere between 30 and 40% of the emissions that are occurring are actually being removed, but we tend not to recognize or value those so much. And in thinking about this, and again about things that are already happening, wondering if any in your group have been looking at these growing areas in the forest sector and opportunities for materials substitution, particularly in the construction industries. One of the I'm asking because I just don't know. It's been of great interest to me to learn recently that there's about a $600 million a year business in something called cross-laminated timber, which can be used to build buildings up to about 15 or 20 stories tall, with potential substitution for steel and concrete, and that's projected to grow by 2 or 3 times in the next 5 years. Are those also opportunities of any significance in terms of shifting the balance more towards the removal side to, in that circumstance, not only having the actual removals, but also the substitution effects associated with them? And just the final thing, as we're thinking about all of these things having ramifications, I'm wondering if anyone other than me feels that it's a bit ironic that one of the big draws for CCS is to use it for injecting to improve oil removal. Thanks.
Yeah. Let me comment briefly, and then I'm going to ask Catherine to speak to the stewardship sinks. You know, when we talk about carbon dioxide removal, Bex has this nominal idea of injecting into geological formations, because we certainly know things about that. But you can also imagine carbon dioxide removal as being long-term storage in constructed structures. You could imagine it as being long-term removal into formation of minerals, into rocks. And you can even imagine it as being specific, purposely buried as either biochar or as other materials in the soil. And I hope that when we talk about carbon dioxide removal, it does include this full set of technologies. I personally agree with you that this idea of using more wood for for construction, especially of taller buildings, is really intriguing, and it's something that has substantial potential, and probably not on this gigaton scale, but substantial potential at the hundreds of millions of tons type of scale. And Catherine, do you want to talk more about sinks in the biosphere and how we particularly think about protecting those sinks at the same time we're utilizing materials and minimizing the risks of things like wildfires?
Great. So indeed, the Earth system is a huge player in the carbon cycle, and I think sometimes when we're just talking about solving climate change, we tend to forget that. So indeed, a lot of carbon is going not only into the land, but also into the oceans. And just to step back close to 2 decades ago, my first exposure to climate change was actually a course from Jim McCarthy, who is co-chair in the IPCC at that point, and he's an ocean scientist. And he was really teaching us how ocean fertilization could lead to a lot of carbon heading into the oceans. Jump back forward to the present moment, we know that the story is a lot more complicated than that, but it raises all these sorts of questions of how big is this Earth system player in the carbon cycle? Is that changing through time? And how does that interface with our ability to change some of these numbers on the edge, recognizing that there's so much carbon in the ocean or in the soils that if you can change it by a little bit, it adds up to a notable fraction. I think a key feature here is that on the one hand, there are really important questions about how the carbon sink function of the land or even the ocean could change with further climate change. So indeed, The land has been helping us out, sopping up a lot of our carbon, but that changes a lot in an El Nino year, for example, where you get a lot of fire happening at the global scale, sending that carbon back out. So those sorts of questions are incredibly important in terms of if we build up that biomass, is it there for the long haul? But the other implication of that is indeed that you can harvest a fraction of that biomass and get more growth in total. Forests in some ways level out in terms of how much carbon they're pulling out of the atmosphere per year, and that can really be embedded with smart timber harvesting or other approaches. There are also interesting questions around, well, which ecosystems have the most carbon and where do they grow? So for example, there's been a lot of attention to redwoods. Redwoods are beautiful, they're charismatic, they also store a ton of carbon. They're really, really big. But there are important questions about where would they be growing in a 4°C world? Are we creating in some ways museum ecosystems that are not even in the current moment where they might want to be if they were to germinate anew? And there are really important questions around what that entails, not only for carbon stored on those landscapes right now, but for how we might want to tap the land moving forward.
Yeah, and Dan's question actually raises a really important point that I think was probably the starting place for all of us, but I don't think we said it explicitly, that you need to think about these carbon issues in a start to finish way such that it would never make sense, for example, to deforest a high carbon tropical forest to put in an energy crop that you would then use for BECCS, because you would need centuries to make up for the carbon loss associated with the initial deforestation, and keeping in mind that that when you do land management, you need to think about the existing stock and your impact on the existing stock before you head down whatever energy trajectory you're headed down. It was a really important point. So we had one over here, and then we'll go. Oh, Bob.
Talk about
I
EOR.
wanted to say something about the EOR.
Oh, great.
Because I think
Sorry.
it's an important question. And I've gone through this own, analysis in my own house, or cogitation, or whatever you want to call it. I wouldn't maybe go as far as analysis. The solution to dealing with oil as one of our issues, obviously it's related to, most of it is used for transportation, although some is used for petrochemical manufacturing. But the demand for oil is the thing we got to manage. Until we manage the demand for oil, people are still going to be getting it out of the ground. And so we need a long-term strategy to reduce the demand for oil. And electrification of transportation and other things is totally part of that. In the near term, using existing oil wells to the maximum extent possible, as opposed to drilling new ones in the Arctic or offshore or wherever, makes some ecological sense. The other factor involved is if the price is at the current level, people are going to want to get the oil out of those existing wells anyway. So what they're doing is they're mining carbon dioxide that's already locked up in the earth, and then they're shoving it into the ground, and there's leakage in that. So to take anthropogenic generated carbon dioxide, to use it to maximize the existing wells that have already been drilled, and then looking at the well to wheel kind of equation there with that carbon sequestered, it's about the gasoline used, in transportation is about 35 to 40% less carbon intensive than oil taken another way. The advantage to doing that is not just that, although that's a modest advantage if we're still not managing the demand for oil. The other advantage is it is an economic model that gets more carbon capture technology built, which the more we build, the cheaper it gets, the more we know we're going to need it in the long haul. This is the cogitation that I've gone through on this, and I think it's not an unreasonable one. And so I think that that's why, from my own personal perspective as well as C2ES, we feel like it's something we can't ignore as a helpful pathway in the near term.
Sally, did you want to comment
No,
more on the EOR?
that's good.
Yeah, thank you. I think there was a question here.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting. I'm Benita Singal. I'm an American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the Department of Energy. And I'm relatively new to this space, but I've been struck just because of my interest in climate models and climate science that there was evidence a long time ago, I don't know if it was decades ago, that we were going to need carbon capture in order to come to some good outcome in terms of climate mitigation. So I'm wondering, but I didn't hear that for a long time, which was why I was so interested in this conference. So I'm wondering, was it this moral hazard issue that it wasn't talked about that much, or was maybe I was in a, not in the right place at the right time?
Who wants to
Maybe,
speak to that?
I'll offer some thoughts about that. So carbon capture, it really entered the narrative back in the 1990s. It was driven largely by the Norwegian government imposing a cost, a price for offshore carbon emissions. They had to pay $50 a ton. And wanting to avoid that, they started to do this, and really a community built up around this. And the IPCC did a special report in 2005 on carbon capture and storage. So among certain circles, I think this was recognized as critical, as essential to achieving 2 degrees C. Why hasn't it taken off more broadly? I think there are many, many reasons. I think that to go back to your, circling and shooting inwards, in the solution space, I think there has been a tremendous amount of competition amongst, the renewables versus carbon capture and storage versus nuclear. And I think everyone is just trying to make the case that their solution is so important and worthy of getting all the help and incentives, that there has been a lack of a really holistic view with the primary goal of being able to achieve our carbon, our carbon goals. So
I think it's also important to distinguish between the CCS agenda, which has been bubbling along for some time, and this negative emissions agenda, which, Catherine said was really invented by an economic model, and the appreciation of, at least nominally, the economic importance of negative emissions is a consequence of the fact that we've made so little progress on decreasing emissions, and that we're right up against the limits for commitment to 2C or even more warming. And had we been serious about tackling the climate problem 20 years ago when we started thinking about CCS, there would be less emphasis now on the negative emissions part of that. Question over on the far wall.
Thank you. Helen Santiago Fink, climate urbanist and consultant. In my work with European structures, the Europeans are also very much have been looking into carbon capture and sequestration, and they've been talking or addressing the risks. I haven't heard much about the risks of the sequestration itself. I know the Germans actually were impacted in some of their particular sites. I'm wondering, what is the reality of the risks with the sequestration, the sites? Does it have potential seismic risks? We know the issue of fracking is already having risks. And I just heard a report actually just the other day in Oklahoma, the earthquake and how there were ramifications of that. So are there similar ramifications in terms of the sequestered sites and the risks that CCS also poses?
Yeah, great question. Sally, do you want to start on that one?
Sure. So the risks of carbon sequestration are very similar to the risks of things like enhanced oil recovery with CO2, natural gas storage, underground disposal of liquid waste, acid gas disposal. So there are many analogous activities which take place throughout the world, throughout our economies, that are managed by a combination of regulation, performance standards on how we drill wells, monitoring requirements, and so forth. So one cannot say this is a zero risk activity. I mean, nothing is zero risk, but with the appropriate management practices, like, for example, having a cap on the maximum amount of pressure increase that you can have during injection, that can be used to mitigate risks of things like induced seismicity. So the risks are very well understood. The largest risks from my perspective are that the CO2 or other fluids would migrate into shallow drinking water aquifers. And you need to make sure that you've selected a site and that you've characterized that site, including any old wells, to make sure that as you operate your project, those risks will not materialize. So this is an activity that needs to be done carefully. There are lots of regulations in place, and by and large, experts conclude that both that the storage can be permanent and that it doesn't introduce a new set of risks beyond those which we have a great deal of experience with.
Sally, we might think about the risks as the induced seismicity and the contamination that you've already mentioned, but also the potential for leakage, that it doesn't stay down there. And
Yeah.
would you say that the sense of feasible technologies covers all three of those areas?
Yeah, absolutely. And the risk of significant leakage back to the surface is actually a very, very small risk. Even if you have a tiny leak, say if it's leaking at 0.5% of the CO2 you're putting in, that would have an enormous signal that would be very easy to monitor. And the most likely leakage pathways are through the wells themselves, and there are many methods for fixing wells. And if that leakage were to occur in some other way, we have shown that if you stop injecting near, say, that leakage feature, that within a short amount of time, the leakage rate drops to extremely small values or even to zero. So that's why to me, number one risk is to groundwater. Induced seismicity is probably not a very large risk for damaging events. There might be very small events that are not felt and don't cause risks. But leakage, back to the atmosphere, is a very low risk, and yeah.
Okay.
Maybe one broader point on this theme. So I think there's been a massive shift in the scientific and technical communities, engineering very much embedded in that over the last decade, and that's been one towards recognizing that responding to climate change is a challenge in managing and reducing risks. And I think this question of how do we solve this problem, it really drives these questions of risk trade-offs right to the fore. So if we took the firing squad with all of the solutions aiming inwards, you could easily knock out every possibility. With wind, you've got birds. With solar, we might put them in deserts and there are organisms there. Nuclear, there are obvious risks. Hydro, same thing. And I think the really key feature is that we are not, as a society, managing risks technology by technology. We're managing risks across this whole system, and that's a system that also involves risks of climate change impacts if we don't figure out these solutions, and also where there are real risks from the technologies we already use. So there are more Americans who die each year from PM 2.5 pollution from coal plants than there are coal miners. We need system solutions that are very responsive to the needs and impacts for every individual actor, but this risk framing is unbelievably important, and that spans from policy through to scientific and technical evaluations.
Great point. Why don't we come back to the middle here, and then we'll go back over there.
Ponciano Manalo with the IHS Market. I was just wondering about if you can expand upon a little bit on the use aspect of CO2 or carbon capture use and storage. I kind of on a personal note, I've been thinking about, what could advanced materials or advanced engineering play a part in providing that economic incentive to essentially foster carbon capture beyond CO2 EOR. For example, I've read about using carbon as a source for energy storage, or as a medium for energy storage, or maybe creating materials from carbon dioxide. So I was just wondering if you can provide what's on the cutting edge right now, and is it a possible way forward to kind of incentivize the increased capture of carbon dioxide?
Great. Dan, you started out with a couple of comments about CO2 use. Do you want to fill
Yeah,
in some more on
I'll
those?
say a few things, and I think in many ways it's a rapidly emerging space. I think that we are just beginning to scratch the surface of what what the feasible technological pathways are for CO2 utilization, especially into long-lived products where you're not just using the CO2 as a gas. I think there are a couple of reasons to be optimistic about it, and I'll just say this broadly before saying a few things about the technologies. One is that carbon capture and utilization is treated at parity as on a life cycle basis in the Section 45Q tax credits that we passed, and so that's a huge driver for folks to think about piloting utilization technologies, including at places like ethanol plants where you have this CO2 being vented. I've talked to folks in the algae community, people thinking about growing algae for all different kinds of things, nutraceuticals, feed products for animals, all the way up to fuels. I think it's a really exciting place. What I think the other part that I think is actually really exciting is we're seeing a world, and Sally mentioned this before, where wholesale electricity prices are likely going to be declining, in part because there are zero marginal cost renewables coming onto the grid. And when you have very low marginal cost renewables, there is an opportunity for very low cost energy to be fed to your utilization process. So unfortunately, taking CO2 and making it into another product, it doesn't create energy, it requires energy. And I think we're entering a world where it might be economical to do things like electrochemical or thermal CO2 reduction that is far beyond what we expected 5 years ago. I'll stop there. Maybe Sally wants to chime in.
Yeah, maybe I'll be a little bit of a temper expectations a little bit. Sorry.
That's fine.
So if you look at making chemicals, for example, from CO2, that very well may be possible, but the scale that we make chemicals compared to the scale of our emissions is very, very small. It's on the order of percentages. So the idea that in and of itself is going to solve the climate problem I think is pretty unrealistic. You need to look at things that can be done at scale. So the only thing that we do at scale that's comparable to our CO2 emissions is using fuel. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. So it says that ultimately, if we really want to make an impact, we've got to be able to make fuels. And there are the best researchers around the world working so hard on, basically, identifying catalysts which can synthesize these fuels. Having said that, though, the amount of energy it takes to basically reassemble carbon dioxide. Well, you have to basically pull apart carbon dioxide, pull apart water, and reassemble them to basically make hydrocarbons. And the amount of energy to do that is very high. And just to give you some numbers, so if you take electricity and you put it into a battery and then you reuse the electricity, you get like 90% of it back, right? So it's 90% round trip efficiency. If you look at making hydrogen by splitting water with electrolysis and then converting that back to electricity that you can use, that's around 30% efficient, okay? So it's way worse than batteries. And that's just on the hydrogen side. Now, if you look at making fuels, hydrocarbon fuels, today, with the best catalyst we can imagine, maybe you'd have 10% round trip efficiency. So we really need some serious breakthroughs to get to the point where we can utilize carbon dioxide at the scale where it will be material for reducing emissions into the atmosphere. Now, having said that, back to the more optimistic side, I am sure that we're going to start seeing lots of small-scale CO2 utilization. There's a company today that's making carbon monoxide. That's a profitable company, out in the West Coast. So I think we'll see a lot of that, but I think we need to temper our expectations about how useful it will be in addressing the climate problem.
Bob?
I would concur with the scale issue. It's huge. I mentioned this in my comments, the scale of what do you do with the carbon now that you've got it. And those pesky covalent bonds. you know. However, I just want to add two things to the mix that you guys just mentioned. One is building materials and concrete. It's used at large scale on a global scale, and also making carbon, nano particles or nano products. But again, the building materials and using it in concrete some way probably has less energy issues than we were just talking about. But using it for any other kind of process is pretty big.
A way to think about it
A
is
reason
that
to keep the nuclear power plants going.
we've been talking about a lot of stuff at gigaton scale. And aside from fuels, the only things we do now that we use at gigaton scale are concrete and steel and sand and gravel. And everything else is budget dust. We're pretty close to the end. I think we might have time for one or two more questions. And I see two more. Why don't we take those two?
Hi, my name is Casey. I'm with CIC Research. I was curious if you guys had any thoughts on the oversight of the permanent sequestration of the CO2 that is used in EOR particularly, but also for Class 4 wells under the 45Q tax credit. Recent reports have showed that a very, very small percentage, I think like 3 million out of the almost 60 million that was claimed under the 45Q tax credits, actually those companies actually provided the proper requirements and reporting plans to the EPA for those tax credits that they did receive, which is pretty shocking. And there's also a current legislation that would also reduce that oversight. So I was curious if you guys had thoughts on that, because obviously, if the point is to reduce emissions, even if you do have to use EOR, if that oversight is not there, it seems like the whole purpose of the technology is lost.
Great question. Dan?
Stab. I guess I have an R on my forehead. Right, regulator. Well, I think the underground injection control program under the Safe Drinking Water Act, I think as you're referring to when you're talking about class of wells, there's an absolute need for oversight, and in many cases, the oversight for Class 6, which is specifically a sequestration class, that oversight has only been delegated to like 1 or 2 states. Class 4, which I think is enhanced oil recovery, Class 2, one of these days. Which one is the experiment class? I can never remember.
I think I might have misspoke. Class 2 were...
Okay, Class 2. You were talking about EOR then, right? Yeah. That has been delegated to a lot of states, particularly in the oil patch, as they say. There is, and I'm not, the thing to keep in mind on this, let me phrase it that way because I don't have enough data to be able to say this is what should happen one way or the other. Oversight is needed for public integrity and for public confidence. There's no doubt about it. To dismiss any oversight of any kind, I think would be, or assume things, have by legislation assume X, Y, Z happens, therefore you don't need to look at it, I think would be a mistake in terms of the integrity of the program and public acceptance of the program. However, I think there's emerging knowledge that carbon dioxide used for enhanced oil recovery that's filling the voids that used to be there for the oil molecules or the is pretty tightly held. That there's not, and I think you were just mentioning very little leakage out of that. So it is conceivable that a new well drilled just for sequestration into some other kind of geology, whether it's a saline formation or some other, would require more oversight than one that's for enhanced oil recovery. That is a possible technically correct answer, but I can't give you all the details on it. So I wouldn't dismiss a differential of oversight, but I don't think we can dismiss oversight of any kind. Is that?
Yeah. Further comments on that one?
No, I'll just say that it is an active political football right now, for sure. Yeah, particularly when you start talking about the quantification and measurement, with to use even more really bad acronyms, subpart RR and subpart UU.
Yeah, because the argument is less so in the legislative arena as it now has moved to the regulatory arena where the Department of Treasury and others have to do the regulations on how the tax credits work. So this is active, I mentioned, I think, in my comments, there's active lobbying going on.
Okay, one more on the other corner here.
Hey, John Noel with Clean Water Action. Just to piggyback on that last question and subpart RR. Right now, there's a major push by oil companies to change those requirements, right? So they want to get tax credits under 45Q, but they don't want to prove or verify that the carbon remains underground. They don't want to check for leaks, and they don't want a long-term monitoring program or report to EPA. So I'm wondering if we can count on some of the same groups that helped push 45Q to the finish line. Can some of those same groups use their political capital to push back on these deregulatory attempts so we can ensure that if we do go full tilt into CCS, that it actually works and the carbon injected underground remains there?
Yeah, I think that's going on as we're sitting here, and as
Really important
Dan
point.
just said.
Yeah.
And I do think though that there may very well be technical and geologic reasons why two different kinds of wells would have different levels of oversight, but they have to have oversight.
I mean, in the long run, I think it's in the best interest of those companies who want to do CO2 capture and storage to make sure that there is a robust enough regulatory framework that will help sustain their license to operate. The risks, and if you look at what's happened with fracking and early on processes for fracking were, creating, emissions and harming surface waters. For those industries who want to be in this for the long haul, it's very damaging to have circumstances like that. So, it's really in the best interest of the industry to have a good set of regulations.
Well,
You meant the social license to operate.
Right, what did I say?
You just said the license.
Oh, the social license, absolutely, social license to operate, absolutely.
Thanks so much to everybody. Let me close with just one thought. A concept you've heard from us throughout today's conversation has been right sizing. And we know that this is an important set of technologies. We know that real progress is being made, but we also know that there are real limits, and we know that there are a wide range of other steps that need to be taken if we're going to effectively confront the climate challenge. And the real issue is how to fit these technologies into a portfolio that we can move forward with. The discussion and the questions from all of you have been really penetrating and helping unfold key issues and helping lay out an agenda that allow us to progress in the future. So if you would join me in thanking yourselves and all the panelists for a wonderful discussion. I also want to thank the team that made it possible here, and that includes Lee Rosenbaum, Natalie Festa, Chris Black, and Molly Field. So thanks again to everybody.